Welcome to the Alameda County Bar Association and the Love Thy Lawyer podcast. I'm Louis Goodman. Today, we welcome attorney Jocelyn Burton to the podcast. Ms. Burton has served as an assistant United States attorney in the Northern District of California, and she's argued in front of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. She's also worked in civil litigation before founding her own firm, Burton Employment Law. She is licensed in both California and North Carolina. Ms. Burton is a longtime member of numerous professional organizations, of course, including the Alameda County Bar Association. Jocelyn Burton, welcome to the Alameda County Bar Association and the Love Thy Lawyer podcast.
Hi.
Hi. Good to see you. Good to have you. Where are you speaking to us from right now?
I'm sitting here in my office.
And where is that? In Oakland?
Yes.
How long have you been at that location and in the kind of practice that you're in at Burton Employment?
Well, right now I'm in a virtual office, but I've been in Oakland downtown since 2010.
Where are you from originally?
I'm originally from Youngstown, Ohio.
Really?
Yes.
And did you go to high school in Youngstown?
No, we moved to Virginia when I was 12, and so I went to high school in Richmond, Virginia.
What was that experience like for you?
Well, when I first moved to Richmond, it was very interesting. I had grown up in Ohio. I had never gone to segregated schools. Most of my classmates started at least at some point in segregated schools. When I got there, they were studying the Civil War, and the book that they used in Virginia throughout the states had what I would happily call the happy slave theory, that, all the slaves were really happy. They were sad when slavery was over because their masters were so good to them. So that was my intro to education in Virginia.
That must have been, I don't know. I just think that must have been kind of a big shock to a young African-American girl who had grown up in Ohio and then had gone to Virginia.
It was. And what I did was a couple months later, I had to do a book report. And so I read Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is, if anybody's ever read it, it's a very long book. It was like 1,700 pages long. And so at that point, it was the longest book I'd ever read. But when I actually had to do the oral report, what I did was talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe and the abolitionist movement, because I wasn't willing to let it rest, even for my classmates, that all the slaves were happy.
Yeah, I remember reading Uncle Tom's Cabin and just being very, very moved by it. I mean, I don't see how anybody couldn't be.
Yeah.
So when you graduated from high school in Richmond, you ultimately went to college where?
Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
What was that experience like compared to being in Richmond?
Well, it was interesting because when I first started at Wake Forest, that was even more challenging than Richmond, because at least in Richmond, we were all bused. So my class was about 50% Black, 50% white. And then when I got to Wake Forest, I was one of 12 Black women in my freshman class.
And how big was the freshman class?
800 students.
Wow. So what was that experience like? I mean, how did you deal with that whole thing? I mean, I'm not saying that it was necessarily a bad experience, but again, I think it's a very different experience than the one you were describing in high school in Richmond.
Yeah, it was a different experience, but one thing, I became very close to all my African American classmates, and then I also wanted to be a part of the entire campus. So I was an RA, I was active. I even joined a sorority in which I was one of 3 Black members. I was involved in a lot of things. And the nice thing about my time there was that, I could do a number of things and still be true to myself.
And when you graduated from college, you ultimately went to law school. Did you take some time off between college and law school, or did you go straight through?
I worked for about a year, and then I went to graduate school and got a master's in public policy from the University of Texas. at Austin at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Matter of fact, I was just there back in Austin this weekend for our 40th reunion from graduate school. And after graduate school, that was my first foray into California. I worked for the legislative analyst office for 2 years in Sacramento. And then I went to law school.
So how did you end up going from the LBJ school in Austin to California? What was that step?
For some reason, the legislative analyst at the time, the legislative analyst at the time hired a couple of the top graduates from each of the top public policy schools. There was a pretty good pipeline from the LBJ school into the California legislative analyst office. So they recruited there, and I was fortunate enough to get the job in California.
When was it that you decided, I want to be a lawyer and I want to apply to law school?
I decided I wanted to be a lawyer when I was 15, but I didn't go directly to law school. And actually, I'm glad I didn't go directly to law school, to be perfectly honest.
Well, what was it when you were 15 years old that made you say, I want to be a lawyer?
I thought I could help people, and I thought that the things that I like to do, research, writing, were well suited to being a lawyer.
And it was the sort of notion of trying to help people with those skills that made you think that the law would be a good avenue for that?
Yes.
Now, when did you actually decide, okay, I'm going to go to law school?
Well, I mean, it was always in the back of my mind. But when I was at the LBJ school, I took the LSAT. I did really well. I decided I did apply to one or two places. I'd gotten in, defer at least one or two schools. But I had this public policy degree. I wanted to see what I could do with it. And besides, I wanted to make a little bit of money before I went to law school.
So where did you ultimately go to law school?
University of Chicago.
Do you think that having taken some time off between college and law school and work in a legally adjacent field made you more focused and a better law student?
Yes, I think taking a year off before grad school made me focus. And I think taking some time off between grad school and law school helped as well. I mean, I remember because my first job out of college, I was supervisor in a department store. And when I went to grad school, I took a shopping bag from that grocery store with me and I taped it in my Carol. And whenever I didn't want to study, I'd look at that bag and say, okay, you could always go back to that department store. So yes, I think having a little work experience gives you a little better perspective and and I think it helps to have been around more people and realize, I mean, one of my frustrations sometimes with some of my fellow law students who've gone straight through, some of them had notions like, well, if you were poor, it's just because you weren't that smart or whatever. And when been out in the world, you realize there are a lot of smart people who just haven't had the same opportunities.
Yeah.
That you had.
Yeah. I had a similar experience. I took a year off between college and law school, and I worked, 2 jobs. And when I got to law school, I used to think, yeah, I could go back to one of those jobs, but you know what? I better pay attention right here. You said where you went to law school, but refresh my recollection one more time, please.
University of Chicago.
University of Chicago. What did you think of being there compared to being in the South? Because now all of a sudden you're back in the Midwest. You're at one of the most competitive schools in the country, and it's another different world for Jocelyn.
Well, believe it or not, I actually found Chicago to be the most racially challenging place I'd ever been.
Really?
Because I was there. It was Harold Washington was the mayor, and you could cut the racial tension with a knife in that city. I'll never forget one of the first days I was there. There was a group it was almost like the first day I got to Chicago. There was a group of white young people who were going to, I think it was a Bruce Springsteen concert, and they happened to get in an accident with a city bus. And it was driven by a black driver. Either all or some of them were killed. The Commonwealth attorney immediately charged the bus driver with manslaughter and had this poor man who was practically in his 60s chained to a hospital bed. Then they did an accident reconstruction later and found out it was the kid's fault. But it's that sort of thing. It was really a tough. I mean, one time, one of my classmates who was a Black man with a PhD was walking the campus with his backpack, and he comes across a white woman, and she, without speaking to him, just takes out a can of mace and sprays him with mace. It was interesting,
to say the least. So when you graduated from Chicago, what was your first legal job? What did you do when you got out of law school?
I went to a big law firm in San Francisco, the old Thielen, Marin, Johnson Bridges law firm.
Yeah. What'd you do there?
General civil litigation. I mean, back then I was fortunate enough to be part of a time which no longer exists where you didn't have to specialize. You could just say, okay, I want to be a civil litigator, and you can dibble and dab in a lot of different areas of civil litigation.
What was your path to the United States Attorney's Office?
My plan was to pay off the student loans, get enough money for a down payment to our house, and then do something fun. So, and I wanted to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I was probably itching a little bit to run with my own cases after 4 years at law firms. It took a little bit longer than that to get a job at the U.S. Attorney's Office, but so I was about 6 years out in my legal career before I got to the U.S. Attorney's Office. But I was thrilled.
Why?
I think it's a great honor to say this is Jocelyn Burton for the United States. Plus, the great thing about the U.S. Attorney's Office, at least in the civil division, it wasn't competitive. I mean, you could walk into somebody's office or send an email, has anybody done a brief on such and such? And they would give it to you. And the other thing is you could always do the right thing.
Yeah, that's what I liked about being a prosecutor, always feeling that you could do the right thing. Can you briefly just walk us through your career from the United States Attorney's Office to what you're doing now with Burton Employment and how you decided to go in that direction?
I spent 12 years at the U.S. Attorney's Office, so about a third of my legal career was there. And after I decided to leave there, I went to another big law firm, this time in North Carolina, and then realized I should go back to California. So I went back to California, and I was working for the courts in Santa Clara for a while. And then the thing that actually encouraged me to start my own practice, my grandfather died. And he always said, well, why don't you start your own practice? When I was going through his papers, I found an obituary for a great uncle. And my great uncle, he was 10 years older than my grandmother. So he was born in roughly 1898. My maternal grandparents were all from a small, Pulaski, Virginia. And they all moved up to Ohio. So they all went up to Ohio and Western Pennsylvania then. And this particular great uncle, when he got up there, they didn't have a school for Black people. So he never finished high school. But when he was working in the steel mills, he started going to night school. And so he finally got his high school degree by going to night school. And then when he finished night school, he came down to North Carolina and he went to North Carolina A&T where he graduated first in his class. And he went to medical school and got his medical degree when he was 37 years old.
Wow.
So when I read his obituary, I thought, well, if he could do that, being born in 1898, I can certainly do this. And the worst thing that can happen if I fail is I go back to another law firm. So that was what led me to make that decision.
As you have sort of alluded to, obviously, you could do pretty much anything that you wanted to do. And whether inside the legal field or outside the legal field. But what is it about practicing law that has kept you in the profession for this long?
One, it's generally intellectually stimulating. dealing with discovery fights is not intellectually stimulating. But if you take that part of the job out of it, it's intellectually stimulating. You get to help people. Every person is interesting. One of the things that I really appreciate about being in a place like California is I have incredibly diverse clients. I mean, clients whose first language, immigrants whose first language is not English, to C-suite level tech people. And it runs the gamut of people and issues, etc. And sometimes it's hard. I mean, sometimes you're trying to manage your clients and you're managing the other side and trying to manage the judge. So it's hard.
If a young person were coming out of college looking for a career, would you recommend the law?
Ooh, I think it's a lot harder than it used to be. I'll be honest. And I would tell people to really look at yourself. If you want to do it to make money, I would say no, don't do it. But if you really want to help people, I wouldn't say don't do it, but it's a lot harder. And I think you need to go into it with your eyes wide open.
What advice would you give to a young attorney just coming out of law school and starting a career? And if you can think about it, what do you think's the best advice that you've ever received? And you could answer either or both questions.
The best advice, when I was, for a little while, when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I was the civil chief. And the advice that I would give to lawyers who were working for me and for associates that I've had was that the most important thing is your reputation. And I told them I wanted it to be such that if I walk into court and tell the judge that the sky is purple, they're at least going to look. Okay. So I really do believe that's the most important thing that you have.
I agree. Yeah. What about the business of practicing law? All of us who are not working for, the government on some level are in business as lawyers. And you've spent time working for the government, but you've also had a successful business as an attorney. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I think that's the hardest part of the job, to be perfectly honest, because none of us went to business school. I mean, you have to learn how to do marketing. Fortunately for me, I had been out. I mean, I think it's a little bit harder for people who decide to open up a shingle right out of law school. For somebody who decided to open up a shingle after 20 years of practice, I knew people who referred the cases to me. But you have to learn marketing. You have to learn accounting. You have to figure out what cases to take and what cases not to take. It's easy to feel sorry for everybody. And sometimes, that's one of the first lessons to learn is to put your ego aside and trust your gut when you're trying to decide whether or not to take a client.
What sort of things do you do to get your mind off of the law? What sort of recreational things do you involve yourself in?
I love to go to the theater. I love concerts. I mean, at one point, pre-pandemic, I had subscriptions to Broadway, SF, or whatever they're calling it now, ACT, Berkeley Rep, Marin Theater Company, was a member of SF Jazz. So I love the performing art of all sorts and reading.
Let's say you came into some real money, $3 or $4 billion. What, if anything, would you do differently in your life?
Take more vacation. That would be the only thing. I'm on the board of my undergraduate college, so I would give them a significant gift. I'm on the board of St. Vincent's Day Home in Oakland. I'd give them a significant gift. But other than that, I don't think I would really want to change a whole lot.
Let's say you had a magic wand. There was one thing that you could change in the legal world or the world in general. What would that be?
In the legal world, I think we've got to, at least on the civil side, we got to figure out a little bit what to do about this discovery issue, because discovery is the issue swallowing up the whole. Nobody follows the rules anymore, and it makes things a lot more difficult. in general world, if I were queen of the world, I would try to make some radical changes to the educational system because I think it's a lot more unequal than it was 40 years ago.
Do you think it's even more unequal now that we don't have legal segregation?
We do have segregation, and I think in a lot of ways the schools are failing more than they did 40 years ago.
Yeah. Well, what I would like to do right now, Jocelyn, is I'd like to bring some of the other people in that we have on the call. I'll have a couple more questions for you after we've had the other people have a chance to talk with you. And to that extent, let's bring in Helen Hoffel. Are you there and available to unmute and have a question or comment for Jocelyn Burton?
Yes, I am here.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. I've loved hearing about your background and your story.
Oh, thank you.
I wanted to just say that I loved your reaction to when you were at the segregated school and your reaction to their view on slavery and the happy slave to write that book report on Uncle Tom's Cabin. I wanted to know what the reaction was and also what kind of support you had going through that, just the shocking time that you had, and I'm sure very difficult.
I was lucky. I mean, my teacher was supportive. She gave me an A. At home, my dad was really active in civil rights. He was working at the Urban League at the time. And I mean, my dad was always at the forefront of these types of issues. I mean, my parents were separated when I was 8 or 9. And when I was 10, I went to live with my dad. And I'm the oldest of 3 children. And my other brothers were 9 and 4 at the time we went to live with dad. At the time, my dad was running community action centers, the Youngstown Community Action Center. I'll never forget at one point we're 10, 9 and 4 and dad is like, well, I'm going to go and sit in today for the welfare rights organization. And you kids, you guys can decide whether you want to stay with a babysitter or go with me to sit in and you might get arrested. My brothers always teased me because they went to sit in and got arrested. I was like, babysitter. And I joked, I was thinking about my security clearance even then.
Thank you. Tracy Lemon.
Been a big fan watching your career for a number of years. So it's a real honor to be in this discussion with you. I guess I have a question for you. I'm an employment attorney as well, and I'm a solo practitioner. So I am always involved in the David versus Goliath cases, and a lot of them involve discrimination, harassment, retaliation, kind of bully tactics that are such a part of our culture and that so many people have experienced in so many ways. But I often find it almost just cruel the way it echoes through litigation and in the discovery with, evasiveness and then the piling on the single employee cases. And I guess I'm just wondering, in your experience, both as a litigator and otherwise, do you have any ideas of how to rectify one of that injustice, the injustice that we're in the legal system? I mean, I'm in motions to compel up to my eyeballs, and there's got to be a better way. There's just got to be a better way.
I was really surprised I am really surprised that over a 30-some year career, just how bad it's gotten. When I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I mean, there was no way I could have gotten away with that kind of behavior because, okay, I'm appearing before the same judges all the time, and they would have read me up one side and down the other if I pull a lot of the tactics that you see regularly. And some of the things that the courts have done to supposedly make it easier for you to get discovery, I don't know if they really work. For example, the IDCs, it gives the defendants a little bit more incentives to hide the ball a little bit longer because you got to request the IDC, and then usually judge doesn't make a decision. They say, well, you can either file a motion or you got to do X, Y, and Z before. So then you got to play this little meet and confer game a little while longer. I mean, when I first started practicing law, if you objected, they were reasonable objections. And when you got them on the other side, you could kind of halfway understand what they were, why they were objecting, and they usually gave you everything. Now you have intelligent people, and I have one right now, when you say any documents that refer to the plaintiff. The term refer to is vague and ambiguous.
What could that possibly mean?
Well, Jocelyn, we'll have to get that magic wand out for you and Tracy.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tracy. Monica Lippis.
I'm a human resources professional and mediator, and I have to say I really appreciate some of the responses that she had to some of your questions, as you know, the very honesty of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Monica. Sin, you're with us today. Do you have a question or a comment for Jocelyn Burton?
I really totally understand when you said it was just an honor to represent the United States. You know, my heart swelled with the pride that you must have felt. And maybe I'm oversensitive to racism or whatever, but that's where it would stem from me is, you know, for my family. You talked about 1800s and you had somebody there that became a doctor, went to medical school, and just to follow through to do that moment when you became part of the U.S. Attorney General's office. That's something I know, you know, I'll never get that.
Okay. Well, I think everyone on the call, I've gotten everyone on the call to have some input.
Actually, I have a question. Sorry to
Yes.
interrupt
Okay.
you. I had my hand up, but
Okay. Oh, thank you. Monica Lippis, can you give us your question?
Yes. So my first question, and again, Ms. Burton, thank you for speaking to us today. Very insightful. But my first question to you is, do you generally represent the employer or the employee or both?
I do both, but primarily plaintiff.
Okay. So let me ask you this. When you were on, one of the things that you had stated was that you really have to kind of pick and choose your clients, if I heard you correctly.
Yeah.
And so how do you feel when you hear a case from an employer's side where you know it's absolutely wrong? Will you take the case?
I think with any client, you got to be on the same page. I mean, you can think that based on what happened that they don't have a very good shot of winning a case, but you can counsel them in such a way that you can attempt to reduce their damage.
Thank you, Monica. Okay, I have a couple of more questions for you, Jocelyn. There's someone, living or dead, who you'd like to meet?
I always wanted to meet Nelson Mandela.
Jocelyn, if someone wants to get in touch with you, someone listening to this podcast who's an attorney that would like to get in touch with you to refer you a case or to ask you some questions, or someone from the public who listens to the podcast and wants to get in touch with you about an issue that you might be able to help them with as an attorney, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
The best way to get in touch with me is through my website, which is www.burtonemploymentlaw.com. It's www.burtonemployment law.com.
Great. Thank you. Jocelyn, is there anything else that you would like to bring up, to mention, that we haven't discussed, that you haven't had a chance to address?
No, the only other advice I'd give to young lawyers, if you're a new lawyer starting out, is to get involved in other organizations. Even if you're in a big firm, get involved with your local instant court, get involved with your barristers committee, get involved with some other organization outside your little law firm. I know you're working hard. It will pay off dividends down the road, because that will be your source of additional job opportunities or referrals later on, those people that you meet along the way. And the wider that net is, the better off you'll be later on.
Well, I think that we met through the Inns of Court.
Right.
And obviously I've seen you at, bar functions, that sort of thing. Since this is the Alameda County Bar Association's podcast, maybe you could talk just a little bit about your experience with the Alameda County Bar Association.
Yes, I've been a member of the Bar Association, at least since I started my practice. And I've been on the Labor and Employment Committee for a number of years, on the Executive Committee, and I've enjoyed it, going to the functions. I've met a number of people through the bar. it is a great source of referral and a way to meet new people. I particularly enjoyed the Inns of Court because that was a way to meet people outside of your own practice group and all sorts of practice groups and have a lot of fun too.
Well, Jocelyn, on behalf of myself and on behalf of the other participants on this call, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the Alameda County Bar Association and the Love Thy Lawyer podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of Love Thy Lawyer. If you enjoyed listening, please share it with a friend and follow the podcast. If you have comments or suggestions, send me an email. Take a look at our website at lovethylawyer.com, where you can find all of our episodes, transcripts, photographs, and information. Thanks to my guests, and to Joel Katz for music, Brian Matheson for technical support, Paul Roberts for social media, and Tracy Harvey. I'm Louis Goodman. I think that no matter what you do, if you're going into something that's going to involve some litigation, get ready to get punched in the mouth.